There is a sound that every farmer in western Kansas carries in his bones, the way a sailor carries the memory of the sea. It is not the sound of a storm. It is not the sound of a gust that comes and passes and leaves silence behind. It is something older and more permanent than either of those things. It is the sound of wind that never stops. Not a breeze, not weather, wind. A steady, relentless current of air that comes rolling off the Colorado plains and crosses the western third of Kansas without hitting a single thing tall enough to slow it down. No mountains, no forests, no hills worth naming. Just flat open prairie stretching to every horizon, and wind moving across it like water moves across glass, frictionless, unstoppable, patient, in the way that only geological forces are patient. In most of America, wind is an event. You notice it on a bad day. You mention it to your neighbor. You forget about it by morning. In western Kansas, wind is geography. It is as permanent as the limestone beneath your feet, as reliable as the flatness of the land itself, and as indifferent to human plans as the sky above it. Emmett Caldwell had lived inside that wind for 44 years. He had been born into it, raised by it, shaped by it, in the particular way that men are shaped by things they cannot change and cannot leave. His father had farmed this same ground before him, and his grandfather before that, and both of them had understood the same fundamental truth about farming in Hamilton County. You did not fight the wind. You absorbed the loss it caused, factored it into your calculations, and kept going. That was the understanding that the community had built itself around. That was the wisdom that passed from father to son, from neighbor to neighbor, from the old men at the grain elevator to the younger men who were just learning what the land cost. The wind was the price of farming here. You paid it every year. You paid it in topsoil that disappeared in brown clouds on the bad days, and in thin yields that told you what the winter had taken even before you ran the numbers. You paid it quietly, and you called it the cost of doing business, and you did not look too hard at the ledger. Emmett had been looking at the ledger for 16 years, and what he saw there in the spring of 1962 was not a sustainable business. It was a slow emergency that nobody was treating like an emergency. His farm sat on the western edge of Hamilton County, a position that sounded neutral on a map, but was anything but neutral on the ground. The Colorado border was 30 miles to his west. Between that border and his fence line, there was nothing. Open range, short grass prairie, 80 miles of uninterrupted flat ground that the wind had been crossing since it came down from the Rocky Mountains, building speed and gathering force with nothing to spend it on until it reached Emmett Caldwell's fields. He was the first farmland the Colorado wind hit when it crossed into Kansas. Every morning when the sun came up and the wind came with it, Emmett's soil was the first soil it touched. His topsoil was the first topsoil it lifted and carried east toward Oklahoma. His crops were the first crops it stripped of moisture. His yields were the first yields it reduced, and his yields showed it with a clarity that could not be argued with. In 1962, Emmett's wheat averaged 21 bushels per acre. The county average was 34. His grain sorghum averaged 42 bushels per acre. The county average was 58. He was farming the same soil in the same climate with the same seed in the same techniques as every other farmer in Hamilton County, and he was getting 60% of what they got. 60% was not a bad year. 60% was not a drought or a disease or a mechanical failure that could be fixed. 60% was the permanent condition of a man farming the worst positioned ground in the county, and it had been the permanent condition for 16 years, and it was getting worse. His topsoil on the west quarter measured 5 inches. 5 inches was the number that Emmett turned over in his mind, the way you turn over a stone you have just found and cannot quite identify. Healthy farmland needed at least 8 inches to support productive crops. 12 was good. 16 was exceptional. 5 was not farming. 5 was the beginning of the end of farming, the thin layer between cultivation and failure, the distance between a working farm and a field that would grow nothing but dust. And the wind was taking it, not dramatically, not in the visible walls of brown air that the old-timers described from the 30s, just steadily, invisibly, a fraction of an inch at a time on each of the 120 windy days that Hamilton County produced every year. A fraction of an inch per year did not sound like much. Over a decade, it was 2 inches. Over 2 decades, it was everything. Emmett had done the arithmetic He had been doing it for years on scraps of paper at the kitchen table and the margins of the account books he kept in the roll-up desk in the corner of the living room. The numbers always came out the same way. At the current rate of loss, the West Quarter would be down to 3 inches of topsoil by 1975. At 3 inches, the soil could no longer hold sufficient moisture to carry a wheat crop through a dry July. At 3 inches, the microbial life that made soil capable of feeding plants would begin to collapse. At 3 inches, he would be farming rock. He was not a man given to panic. He had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 4 decades working in conditions that did not respond to agitation, who had learned early that the land required patience and observation above all other qualities. He moved through his days at the pace of necessary work, not hurried, not slow-shaped by the rhythms of planting and harvest in the 100 smaller tasks that kept a farm functional between seasons. But the arithmetic would not leave him alone. Wesley Pruitt had been the county extension agent in Hamilton County since 1955. He was 52 years old, a thin, methodical man with a government pickup truck and a briefcase full of literature from the Soil Conservation Service, and he had been delivering the same message to the farmers of Hamilton County every year since he arrived. Plant shelter belts. Trees were the proven, researched, federally recommended solution to wind erosion on the Great Plains. Red cedar, Austrian pine, Rocky Mountain juniper. Rows of trees planted along the western boundary of a field, spaced to create maximum wind resistance, designed to protect the soil behind them for decades. Wesley believed in the shelter belt program the way some men believe in a church. He had the studies. He had the yield data from farms that had planted windbreaks in the 40s. He had the before and after photographs that made the case visually undeniably in a way that should have convinced anyone who looked at them. He brought these things to the annual conservation meeting every year and laid them out on the folding tables in the community hall and walked through the evidence with the careful thoroughness of a man who was certain he was right. And he was right. The shelter belts worked. The data was real. The evidence was solid. Trees planted along a field boundary reduced wind speed, retained topsoil, conserved moisture, and improved yields across the protected ground. This was not theory. This was 60 years of documented results from farms across the Great Plains. Emmett had considered it. He had priced the seedlings from the Kansas Forest Service. $200 for enough trees to plant a quarter-mile row along his western boundary. The cost was manageable. The time was not. A freshly planted tree row was not a windbreak. It was a promise. A seedling was 3 feet tall and about as useful for stopping wind as a fence post made of string. The trees needed 15 to 20 years to reach the height and density required to significantly reduce wind speed across a field. 15 to 20 years of watching saplings grow while the wind continued its work. 15 to 20 years of thin yields on the west quarter while the topsoil that remained continued to blow east. Emmett had 5 inches of topsoil. At the current rate of loss, he would be at 3 inches by the time those trees were tall enough to matter. He would have spent 20 years waiting for protection that arrived after the land it was supposed to protect had already been destroyed. He told Wesley this on a morning in late March of 1962. They were standing at the edge of the west quarter, looking at the field, and Emmett walked through the calculation the way he had walked through it 100 times at the kitchen table. Wesley listened. He was a fair man, and he was a careful listener, and when Emmett finished, he did not dismiss what he had heard. But he also did not have another answer. What he had was the Shelter Belt program, and the Shelter Belt program was what he recommended. And when Emmett pointed to the corner of the field where the rocks were piled, the rocks he had pulled out of the soil during spring tillage and dumped against the fence, Wesley looked at them with the expression of a man who is being asked to accept something his training has not prepared him for. Emmett said he wanted to build a wall, 4 feet high, along his entire western boundary, half a mile. Wesley looked at the rock pile. He looked at Emmett. He looked at the rock pile again. A stone wall, Wesley said, was not a recognized soil conservation practice. There was no research supporting stone walls as windbreaks in Great Plains agriculture. The Soil Conservation Service recommended tree shelter belts, grass strips, and strip cropping. Nobody built walls? Nobody in Kansas, Emmett said. But they build them in Scotland. They build them in Ireland. They build them in New England. And they have been building them for 1,000 years. The wind blows in those places too. Wesley wrote something in his notebook. He closed the notebook. He told Emmett to think carefully before committing to something that would consume that much time and labor. He said the shelter belt program was still the proven approach. He drove away in his government pickup truck. Emmett stood at the edge of his field and looked at the rocks. He had been looking at rocks his entire life. Every spring, for 16 years before he could plant, he walked his fields with a stone boat dragged behind the tractor and picked up rocks. The freeze and thaw cycle of Kansas winters pushed them to the surface the way bread dough pushes raisins upward when it rises. Every spring there were new rocks where the soil had shifted over winter, and every spring Emmett gathered them and hauled them to the fence line or the gully or the gravel pit outside Syracuse. He hated rocks. He had always hated rocks. They broke plow blades. They jammed the combine header at the worst possible moments. They punctured tractor tires in the middle of a field a quarter mile from the nearest road. They dulled cultivator shovels and damaged equipment and cost him money and time every spring without exception. They were the most consistent, reliable nuisance his land produced. He stood at the fence line and looked at the pile he had made that spring. Limestone mostly in pieces, ranging from the size of a man's fist to pieces the size of a dinner plate. Some granite, some flint, some sandstone from the old river channels. Each piece pulled from the soil of his own fields, carried to this corner and dumped as waste. And he turned them over in his mind the same way he had been turning the arithmetic over, looking at them from a different angle than he had ever looked at them before. He thought about the barn, the grain bin, the equipment shed. He thought about the way the dust behaved on a windy day, the way it moved across the open field in long horizontal sheets and then stopped suddenly at the wall of each building, the way it piled against the windward face of the structures and then dropped, and the way on the downwind side the ground was always different, darker, less disturbed. A strip of relative calm where the wind had lost its energy against the vertical surface and could not immediately recover it. He had noticed this for years without thinking about what it meant. You noticed things on a farm because noticing was survival. You tracked weather patterns and soil color, and the way water moved through the low places in a field after a hard rain. You built up a library of observation over decades, and most of what was in that library you could not have articulated in words, but it shaped every decision you made. What the buildings told him was simple. Vertical surfaces interrupted wind. They did not eliminate it. The wind went over the pump and around the ends and kept moving, but for a distance downwind from any vertical surface, the velocity dropped. The soil stayed put. The moisture stayed in the ground. The crops grew better. A wall was a longer, lower version of a building. He did not know if it would work at the scale he was imagining. He could not find anyone who had tried it on Kansas farmland. He had nothing to go on except the physics he had been watching for 16 years, and the certainty that what he was currently doing was not going to be sufficient. He needed to try something. The alternative was to keep farming while his topsoil disappeared inch by inch until there was nothing left to farm. He started building the next day. Burton Hale heard about it within a week. Burton ran the John Deere dealership in Syracuse, had run it for 15 years, and had positioned himself as the most knowledgeable man in Hamilton County on the subject of modern farming. He was 49 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the easy public confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything in front of an audience. He was good at an audience. He understood instinctively that the farmers who came into his dealership were not just buying equipment. They were buying the reassurance that the decisions they were making were the right decisions, and Burton provided that reassurance with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed his own authority. He heard about Emmett Caldwell building a wall out of rocks, and he knew immediately what to do with the information. He waited until the Saturday morning crowd was assembled at the Farm Cooperative in Syracuse. These gatherings happened naturally the way things happen naturally in small agricultural communities. Men who came to buy seed or price supplies or settle accounts would find other men already there, and the conversation would spread and deepen and become the kind of shared commentary on local events that served the community as both information exchange and entertainment. Burton announced it like a man who had been saving a good story. Emmett Caldwell, he said, was building a medieval wall, 4 feet high, out of rocks, along his west fence line, to stop the Kansas wind. He paused to let the image settle. The crowd laughed. Burton let the laughter run, then added the part about the moat, about the drawbridge, about going back to the Stone Age while the rest of Hamilton County was investing in center pivots and modern equipment. He was good at this. He had a salesman's ear for the phrase that made a room feel like it was in on something together, and the phrase he had found for Emmett Caldwell's project was perfect, medieval. The word did everything he needed it to do. It made the wall sound not just impractical, but embarrassing, a step backward into a past that serious men had left behind. The name that came out of that Saturday morning was Rockman. It was not a cruel name in the way that some names are cruel. It was the kind of name that communities give to the person who has stepped outside the consensus, the quiet insistence that the person understand their position relative to the group. In Hamilton County in 1962, the consensus about farming was built on machinery and chemistry and irrigation, on the tools that had transformed agriculture in the decades since the Dust Bowl. The consensus did not include dry stacked stone walls, and a man who built one was by definition someone who had not gotten the message. Emmett heard the name. It came back to him the way things came back in small communities, through the indirect channels of passing conversation and the careful way people sometimes did not look at you directly. He heard it and registered it the way he registered everything, without visible reaction, filed away in the part of his mind where he kept the information that was real but not actionable. Vera heard it differently. She heard it from the woman at the next property east, in the kind of conversation that begins as neighborly exchange and becomes something more complicated when a name comes up. The woman did not say it unkindly. She probably thought she was being helpful. She said she had heard some of the men talking at the cooperative, and she wanted Vera to know that the talk was getting around, and she hoped everything was all right with Emmett. Vera thanked her and drove home and put supper on, and did not say anything to Emmett that evening. She set the plates on the table and sat across from him and watched him eat, and the silence between them had a quality she did not entirely recognize. It was not the comfortable silence of a long marriage. It was the silence of something unspoken that was taking up space. She was not a woman who avoided the things that needed saying. She had 41 years of plainness and practicality behind her, the kind of character that Western Kansas produced in the people it kept. She knew how to deliver difficult information without drama. She knew how to ask a hard question without it becoming a confrontation. She also knew Emmett. She had known him for 23 years of marriage, and before that through the years when their families had farmed neighboring ground, and she had watched him develop the particular quality of attention that defined him. He was not reckless. He did not make decisions without thinking them through in every direction. If he had decided to build this wall, he had a reason, and the reason was not stubbornness, and it was not nostalgia, and it was not any of the things that Burton Hale had implied in front of the cooperative crowd. But she also could not entirely quiet the arithmetic she was doing in her own mind. 6 months of labor, he had estimated, maybe longer, time taken from the 100 other tasks a farm required. Effort spent on something that no one else believed in, that no one had tested, that existed as an idea in one man's head and nowhere else. And at the end of that labor, if the wall did not perform the way he believed it would, they would have lost the time and the energy and the community standing and still have the same thin topsoil and the same inadequate yields and the same wind arriving every morning from Colorado. She put the dishes in the sink and did not say anything that night. Emmett was building the wall. He had started on the southwest corner of the property, working north along the fence line with the systematic patience that characterized everything he did. His plan was simple in the way that plans drawn from direct observation are always simple. A dry stacked stone wall, no mortar, no cement, 4 feet high and 18 inches wide, running the full length of his western boundary, 2,640 feet, half a mile. Dry stacking was an old technique, older than Kansas, older than America. The principle was friction and gravity. You selected your stones for shape and fit, placed the larger flat stones at the base, and built upward, interlocking each new course with the ones below it, fitting each piece against its neighbors, with the kind of three-dimensional judgment that could not be taught from a book, but could be learned from handling enough stone. Emmett had not read a book about dry stacking. He had no training in masonry or construction beyond what 16 years of farm maintenance had given him. What he had was something more particular and more useful. He had 16 years of handling the specific stones that came out of his specific fields. He knew their weight, their texture, their tendency. He knew which pieces were flat enough to lock tight and which were too round to trust. He knew the difference between limestone that would hold its shape through a freeze-thaw cycle and limestone that would crack and shift. He had this knowledge, the way craftsmen have knowledge of their materials accumulated through contact rather than studies stored in the hands rather than the mind. And when he began laying the first course of stones along the southwest corner of his property, he found that the knowledge was adequate to the task. He worked in the hours the farm gave him. 2 hours before fieldwork in the morning when the light was still low and the air had not yet reached the temperature that made physical labor taxing. 2 hours in the evening after fieldwork was done in the long summer light that lingered past 8 o'clock and gave the plains a particular quality of amber stillness. Weekends he worked all day from first light to last, with breaks only for meals. He hauled rocks from his own fields first. Then as word spread that he was looking for stone from the fields of neighbors who were glad to have the clearing done for free. He drove his truck slowly along fence lines while his neighbors talked loading pieces from the piles that every farmer accumulated over the course of spring tillage. It costs nothing, the neighbors said. Saves me hauling them to the pit. They meant it generously. What they also meant, and what they did not need to say, because the community understood, it was that Emmett Caldwell was welcome to every rock they had, because what he was doing with those rocks would not work, and their charity cost them nothing, because the project would fail on its own terms without requiring any failure of generosity on their part. Emmett loaded their rocks into his truck and drove them to his western fence line and stacked them with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He did not tell anyone that he was watching the wall even as he built it, that with every section completed, every 100 feet of stone, laid and fitted and leveled, he was observing the way the wind interacted with what he had made, the way the dust behaved differently on the downwind side of a completed section, the way the soil color changed in the strip behind the wall after a series of windy days remaining darker, indicating that the fine particles were staying put rather than blowing east. He watched these things and recorded them in the margin of his farm journal in the shorthand he used for field observations. Small notes, numbers, measurements made with a tape measure and a thermometer, and the attentive eyes of a man who had been watching this particular landscape for 4 decades. He did not share the notes. Not with Vera, not with anyone. There was a reason for this, and the reason was not secretiveness. The reason was that he understood with the same clarity that had defined his approach to every difficult problem the farm had presented that the time to speak was not when you believed something. The time to speak was when you could show something. Belief without demonstration was only conviction, and in Hamilton County, Kansas in 1962, conviction was not going to be sufficient. He needed a full season behind a complete wall. He needed yield numbers, soil measurements, data that could be seen from the county road by anyone who drove past. He needed the wall to speak for itself in the only language that farming communities trusted. Until then, he had rocks and time, and he used them both with the patience of a man who understood that some arguments could only be won slowly. By the end of 1962, he had completed roughly 400 feet of wall, a sixth of the total distance. The wall was 4 feet high, 18 inches wide at the base, tapering slightly toward the top. Each stone had been selected and placed by hand. There were no straight lines. The wall followed the contour of the ground, accommodating the small rises and falls of the fence line, the way a river accommodates its channel, working with the land rather than imposing a geometry onto it. It was by any honest measure a piece of work that required both skill and commitment. The stones were fitted with a precision that you noticed before you understood why you noticed it, each piece resting firmly against its neighbors, no gap wide enough to admit a fist, no section that rocked or shifted when you pressed your hand against it. The wall looked like something that had been there for a long time, or like something that intended to be there for a long time, which amounted to the same thing in the end. Burton Hale drove past it on his way to a service call in late November and slowed his truck to look. He drove on without stopping. Back at the dealership, he added one detail to the story he had been telling all fall. The medieval wall, he now said, was actually being built. The rockman was serious, and he said this with the same easy amusement he had brought to the subject from the beginning, because Burton Hale had been selling farm equipment in western Kansas for 15 years, and he understood in the way that a man understands things that confirm his experience that stone walls did not stop Kansas wind. The wind was too big, the land was too flat. The problem was too fundamental to be solved by a farmer with a truck and a pile of fieldstones, and an idea he had gotten from looking at old buildings in countries that were nothing like Kansas. Emmett kept building. The winter came down hard from the north, the way it always came, and the wind that had been taking his topsoil since 1946 came with it. And Emmett Caldwell went out every morning before fieldwork and set stone on stone along his western fence line, and came back every evening and set stone on stone again. And the wall grew one course at a time into the pale flat light of a Kansas winter. His neighbors drove past it on the county road and shook their heads with a kind of bemused respect that was distinct from actual respect. They thought he was wrong. They also thought he was committed, and in a community that valued commitment as a character trait, even when the thing committed to was misguided, this counted for something. His son Danny was 16 years old that winter, quiet in the way of a boy who observes more than he speaks, and he watched his father come in from the wall each evening with the particular attention that children give to things they are trying to understand. He did not ask his father directly what he was doing or why. He watched. Vera watched too from the kitchen window from the front porch in the evenings. She watched Emmett at the wall in the gray winter light, the steady motion of a man handling heavy material, bending and lifting and placing and adjusting. The wall growing longer. And she thought about the name the community had given her husband, and she thought about the arithmetic that could not be ignored, and she did not yet know which of these two things was going to win. The wind kept blowing, Emmett kept building, and somewhere in the limestone and flint and granite being laid along the western edge of a Kansas farm, a different kind of answer was beginning to take shape. The second year began the way the first had ended, with cold ground and a gray sky, and Emmett Caldwell at his western fence line before the sun had cleared the cedar breaks to the east. He had 400 feet of wall behind him. He had 2,200 feet ahead of him. He had the same 2 hours in the morning and the same 2 hours in the evening and in the same full days on weekends. And he had learned enough in the first year to know that the pace was not going to change and could not be forced. The wall would be done when it was done. The only variable was whether he stopped, and stopping was not something he had included in his calculations. The rocks kept coming. His neighbors had accepted by now that the request was permanent, that Emmett Caldwell would continue to appear at their fence lines with his truck and his loading gloves and his eye for stone, and that the rocks he took would not return. They gave freely. The gift cost them nothing and removed something they considered a nuisance. And if the man wanted to build his medieval wall with the proceeds, that was his business and his error and his time. What they noticed without commenting on it directly was the quality of attention he brought to the selection. He did not take every rock offered. He walked the piles, slowly turning pieces over, testing weight and flatness and the particular angle of a surface that would lock against another surface when placed. He left the round ones, the ones that would sit unstably on a course and transmit their instability to everything above them. He took the flat ones, the angular ones, the pieces with natural ledges that would key into the stones beside them and hold. He was building something that had to resist three things simultaneously: gravity, which pulled everything downward and outward; wind, which pressed against the face of the wall with sustained horizontal force; and the freeze and thaw of Kansas winters, which worked at every joint and gap with the patient leverage of water expanding into ice and contracting again. A wall that failed any one of these tests was not a wall. It was a pile. Emmett understood this not from engineering but from observation. He had watched stone structures on farms across the county behave over decades, had seen the ones that lasted and the ones that did not, and the difference was always in the fitting. A well-fitted dry stone wall was stronger than a mortared wall because it was flexible. The stones could shift microscopically under pressure and return, distributing stress across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at a single point. Mortar created rigidity, and rigidity in a climate with 2-foot frost depth and 60-degree temperature swings between seasons was the precondition for failure. He fitted each stone with the patience this required. Some pieces went in on the first attempt. Some required multiple tries, repositioning, rotating, flipping to find the orientation that matched the surface below. Some pieces he picked up and set aside and came back to an hour later with fresh eyes. The wall was not fast work. It was not supposed to be fast work. It was supposed to be permanent work, and permanence in stone had a different relationship with time than most things Emmett dealt with on the farm. By the end of 1963, he had completed 900 feet of wall. That spring, before he began field work on the west quarter, he walked the length of the completed section and looked at the wheat that had come up behind it. The wheat within 60 feet of the wall was taller than the wheat in the unprotected ground to the north. Not dramatically taller, 2 inches approximately when he measured with the flat of his hand and then with the tape from his coat pocket. 2 inches in early season wheat was not a number that would impress anyone who did not understand what it represented. But Emmett understood what it represented. 2 inches of additional height at this stage of development meant more moisture in the root zone. It meant less wind stress on the developing stalks. It meant a microclimate that had been subtly but genuinely altered by 900 feet of stone. He stood in the field for a long time with the tape measure in his hand. Then he put the tape in his pocket and walked back to the tractor. He did not tell Vera. He did not tell Danny. He did not stop at the cooperative in Syracuse and mention what he had found to the men who called him a rockman. He opened his farm journal that evening and made a note in the margin. Measured height differential, April 14th. Wall side average, 8.2 inches. Open ground average, 6.1 inches. 2-inch advantage within 60 feet of completed section. Wind reduction confirmed at crop level. He closed the journal and put it in the roll-up desk and went to bed. The reason for the silence was not complicated. 2 inches of height advantage in 60 feet of wheat was a data point. It was a promising data point, one that confirmed the direction of his thinking, but it was a single measurement in a single spring at a scale that represented less than a third of the total project. The people he would eventually need to convince required more than a data point. They required a picture visible from a moving vehicle on the county road. They required yield numbers that came back from the elevator with his name on them. They required the kind of evidence that did not need explanation because it explained itself. He was not there yet. He kept building. 1963 added 500 feet. 1964 added 600. By the end of the 1964 season, 1,500 feet of wall ran along his western boundary, just over half the total distance. The section behind the completed wall was visibly different from the section still exposed. The soil color was darker along the protected strip. The wheat stand in the fall planting was denser and more uniform. The difference was real and it was growing, and the people who drove the county road past Emmett Caldwell's farm were beginning to notice it without knowing what to call what they were noticing. "Have you seen the south half of his west field?" they said at the cooperative. "Looks different from the north half." Different how someone would ask. Just different. Darker, thicker, like it had a better year. Nobody said the wall. Nobody was ready to credit a pile of fieldstones with altering the agricultural outcome of 80 acres of wheat ground. There was always another explanation available. Different soil on that end of the field. Different irrigation pressure. Different seed lot. The explanations accumulated the way explanations always accumulate around outcomes that challenge the established understanding. Each one individually plausible, collectively forming a barrier against the conclusion that the obvious cause was the real cause. Emmett noted the conversations when they reached him and added nothing to them. Then came 1965. The summer of 1965 was the driest summer in Hamilton County in a decade. The rain that should have come in June did not come. The rain that should have come in July came as 20 minutes of hard pellets that ran off the baked ground without penetrating. By August, the subsoil moisture was depleted to a depth that the old-timers had not seen since the early 50s, and the wheat that farmers across the county had planted with reasonable optimism in the fall was struggling in ways that careful management could not fully address. Emmett lost yield that year. He was not immune to drought. No wall stopped the rain from not falling, and the west quarter, even behind 1,500 feet of completed wall, could not fully compensate for a moisture deficit that ran 3 feet into the ground. His numbers were bad, but they were less bad behind the wall than in front of it. He knew this because he had been measuring, not just the height differential in spring, but the soil moisture at intervals behind and in front of the completed section, pushing a rod into the ground and recording the depth at which it met resistance, comparing the numbers across the length of the field. The protected strip retained moisture longer. It dried more slowly. On the worst days of August, when the unprotected ground had the cracked, pale appearance of ground that had given everything it had, the soil behind the wall was still darker, still holding. The difference was not large enough to save the year. The drought was too severe for 1,500 feet of wall to overcome on a field that needed twice that length of protection. But the difference was real and it was consistent, and Emmett added it to the journal with the same quiet precision he brought to all his notes. Burton Hale did not have Emmett's numbers. What Burton had was the county yield data that circulated through the cooperative in September, and the county yield data showed that Emmett Caldwell had lost yield like everyone else, which was all Burton needed to work with. He was at the cooperative on a Friday morning in late September when a group of farmers came in for seed pricing, and he said what he had been waiting to say since the yield numbers came out. The rock man lost his crop just like everyone else. He let the pause do its work. Turns out rocks do not stop drought. The laughter was different from the laughter of 1962. In 1962, the laughter had been the laughter of a community dismissing something new. This laughter had the edge of confirmation in it, the particular satisfaction of people who had doubted and been proven right. 3 years of watching a man stack rocks along his fence line, 3 years of the difference in his field being explained away as something other than what it was, and now a drought year to confirm what the skeptics had been saying all along. Emmett heard about it as he heard about everything through the indirect channels of a small community. He was not there when Burton spoke. He heard the substance of it from a passing reference in a different conversation, and he registered it the way he registered things without visible reaction, filed and noted. What he could not file away as easily was what happened that evening at the supper table. He and Vera had eaten most of the meal in the kind of silence that was ordinary between them, the comfortable quiet of two people who had been in the same house for long enough that silence was not absence but presence. The children were mostly grown. Danny was 19 now, working the farm with Emmett through the summer, quiet, in the way he had always been quiet, watching in the way he had always watched. Danny had gone out after supper. It was just Emmett and Vera at the table with the dishes between them and the evening light coming through the west window, and Vera looked at him with an expression he had not seen before or had not let himself see before. It was not doubt exactly. It was something more complicated than doubt and more painful. It was the expression of a woman who had stood beside a decision for 3 years without being fully inside it, who had absorbed the community talk in the drought year and the laughter at the cooperative, and who was now asking a question she had been not asking for a long time. Tell me you still believe in this. The words were quiet. They were not accusatory. They were the words of a woman who needed to know whether what her husband was doing was still grounded in something real or whether it had become the kind of commitment that a man maintains past the point of reason because admitting it was wrong would cost too much. Emmett sat with the question for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because the answer deserved to be given correctly. He got up from the table and went to the roll-up desk in the corner and took out the farm journal. He brought it back and set it open in front of Vera. He turned to the pages from 1963, the first spring measurements, and he walked her through them. The height differential, the moisture readings, the soil color observations. He turned to 1964 and showed her the same measurements repeated and deepened the pattern, strengthening with each additional season. He turned to 1965 and showed her the drought year numbers, the ones that showed his yield was down like everyone else, but that the moisture retention behind the wall had remained measurably better than the unprotected ground throughout the worst of the dry months. He did not say anything while she read. He let the numbers speak. Vera read slowly. She turned the pages herself when she was ready for the next set. She was not an agricultural scientist. She was a woman who had kept household accounts for 20 years and understood what numbers and columns meant when they told a consistent story. The journal told a consistent story. When she had read what she needed to read, she closed it and pushed it back toward him. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she stood up and cleared the remaining dishes from the table without speaking. The next morning, Emmett went out to the wall before first light the way he always did. He was setting up his stone boat when he heard the back door of the house, and he turned to see Vera coming across the yard in her work coat with 2 cups of coffee. She had not done this before. Not once in 3 years. She handed him one of the cups and stood beside him for a moment looking at the wall in the early gray light. She went back inside without saying anything. Emmett held the coffee and looked at the wall and understood that something had shifted that could not be unshifted. He kept building. The year 1966 added 400 feet. 1966 was also the year that Danny, 20 years old now, appeared at the wall one Saturday morning before Emmett arrived. Emmett came out in the early light to find his son already there standing at the end of the last completed section, looking at the pile of rock that had accumulated during the week. Danny had the loading gloves in his hands. He was studying the pile the way Emmett studied it, with the assessing eye of someone trying to read which pieces would be useful. Emmett did not say anything. He put on his own gloves and went to the other end of the pile and began sorting. They worked alongside each other for the entire morning without a conversation that amounted to more than the practical coordination of two people doing the same physical task in the same space. Which stone, where it went, whether a particular piece was flat enough to trust on the next course. The communication that happens between people who are working together at something that requires attention and does not leave room for anything else. At midday, Danny went in for lunch and came back out with the same wordlessness he had arrived with. They worked through the afternoon. In the evening, when the light was going, Emmett set his last stone and straightened and looked at what they had laid. 60 feet of wall in a day, more than he managed alone. He looked at his son standing at the other end of the day's work, pulling off his gloves, looking south along the length of the wall, toward the original section, now 4 years old and settled into the landscape. Emmett understood something in that moment that the farm journal could not have contained. The wall was not only about wind and topsoil and yield numbers. It had never been only about those things, although those things were real and were the reason the wall existed. It was also about what a man built and whether it outlasted him. It was about the particular kind of knowledge that passed between a father and a son, not through instruction, but through proximity, through the shared handling of heavy things, through seasons of watching and eventually doing. Danny had been watching for 4 years. Now he was doing. They walked in for supper together. By October of 1967, the wall was finished. 2,640 feet, half a mile. Approximately 10,000 individual stones, each one selected, carried and placed by hand over the course of 6 years and some months. The wall ran from the southwest corner of Emmett's property to the northwest corner without interruption, 4 feet high, for its entire length, tapering slightly at the top, following the contour of the ground, with the organic logic of something that had grown from the landscape rather than been imposed upon it. Emmett walked it from end to end on the morning of completion. He moved slowly, running his hand along the top course, feeling the solidity of what had been built. The stones that had been set in 1962 had settled into a density that the newer sections had not yet reached. The courses keyed so tightly together that the wall felt less like stacked stone and more like a single continuous piece of material. He stopped at the midpoint and turned to face east, looking across his west quarter toward the farmstead a quarter-mile away. The morning wind was coming from the northwest, steady and cold, in the way of October wind, and he could feel it on his face and hear it moving through the dry wheat stubble of the harvested field. He turned west to face the wall. The wind pressed against the stones. The stones did not move. On the downwind side where he was standing, the air was different. Not calm, not entirely still, but reduced. The sustained force that he could feel against his back when he faced west was not present on the east side of the wall. The air moved, but it did not drive. The pressure was gone. He stood between the wall and the field for a long time, not because he needed to verify what he already knew, but because the moment deserved to be inhabited. 6 years of early mornings and late evenings and weekends in every weather. 6 years of the community calling him Rockman and meaning it as dismissal. 6 years of numbers in a journal that he had shared with no one except his wife on one difficult evening in a drought year. The wall was done. The answer was in the stone. He walked back to the farmstead, put his gloves in the barn, and went in for breakfast. Danny was at the table. He looked up when his father came in and asked the question directly the way Danny asked things when he had been thinking about them long enough. He asked his father if he was satisfied. Emmett poured his coffee and sat down and thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. "Ask me after harvest," he said. The winter of 1967 into 1968 was not exceptional by Kansas standards. The cold came and stayed, and the wind came with it, and the wall that Emmett had built faced its first full winter season as a complete structure. He watched it through the cold months with the attention he had brought to everything associated with it. He watched the snow fence effect that developed on the downwind side, the drifts that formed and deepened as the season progressed, accumulating on the east face of the wall in the way that moisture accumulates behind any barrier. He noted this in the journal. Snow caught by the wall would melt in spring. It would melt slowly into the soil directly behind the wall in the strip where the crops would eventually grow. Free water delivered by the same wind that had been stealing his moisture for 20 years, now redirected by stone. He watched the soil behind the wall stay darker through the dry months of February and March, when the unprotected ground turned pale with cold and wind. The protected strip held its color, held its moisture, held its structure. He planted the West Quarter in April of 1968 with a density he had not attempted before on that ground because the stand data from the previous 4 years told him the protected soil would support it. He planted into moisture that was present at the right depth. He planted with the particular confidence of a man who has been taking measurements for 5 years and trusts what the measurements tell him. He did not tell anyone what he expected. He watched the wheat come up through May, the way he watched everything with the daily attention of a man who is committed to an outcome and is watching the world respond to the commitment. The stand that emerged behind the wall was the best stand he had ever seen on the West Quarter. Dense uniform, deeply green, the stalks growing straight without the lean and stress that wind-damaged wheat showed in its early weeks. The plants within 200 feet of the wall showed the particular vigor of crops growing in conditions that matched their requirements. He measured the stand density in early June. He measured the soil moisture at 3 depths. He measured the wind speed on both sides of the wall, using the simple method of timing how long it took a piece of thread tied to a fence post to extend fully horizontal. The thread on the windward side extended in seconds. The thread on the downwind side took much longer and extended at a shallower angle. He wrote the numbers in the journal. Wesley Pruitt came through Hamilton County on his annual crop tour in late May, the way he came every year, driving the county roads in his government truck and stopping at fields that showed something worth stopping for. He stopped at Emmett Caldwell's West Quarter. He pulled off the county road and stood at the fence for a long time before he got out of the truck. The difference between the protected wheat and the county wheat visible across the fence line to the north was apparent from the road. Not subtle, not something you had to look for. The wheat behind the wall was a different shade of green. It was taller. The stand was visibly thicker. The soil between the rows was darker, indicating moisture retention that the adjacent unprotected ground did not have. Wesley walked the field with Emmett in the early June morning. He walked slowly the way he walked when he was thinking, stopping to examine the wheat, crouching, to look at the soil, pressing his hand flat against the ground to feel the moisture at the surface. He stopped at a point about 150 feet from the wall and turned to look back at it. Then he turned to look east toward the unprotected portion of the field beyond the wall's influence. The line where the wall's effect ended and open field conditions resumed was visible in the crop. Not a sharp line, but a gradient, the wheat thinning and paling as it moved further from the protection of the stone. Wesley had been an extension agent for 17 years. He had walked hundreds of fields in western Kansas, and he understood what healthy wheat looked like and what stressed wheat looked like, and what the difference between the two indicated about the conditions a crop had grown in. What he was looking at was healthy wheat on ground that had produced stressed wheat for 16 years. "What are you seeing?" Emmett said. It was not quite a question. Wesley looked at the wall. He looked at the wheat. He looked at the wall again. He said that the wind speed reduction behind a 4-foot wall should theoretically affect a distance of 10 to 15 times the wall's height on the downwind side. 4 feet times 15 was 60 feet, but the effect he was seeing extended well beyond 60 feet. Emmett said it was not just the height, it was the mass. The wall weighed close to 150 tons. The wind hit it, and the energy had to go somewhere. Some went over the top, some went around the ends, but a significant amount of it dissipated against the structure itself. He picked up a flat piece of limestone from the base of the wall, a piece the size of a dinner plate. He said that each stone was essentially a baffle. The wind entered the gaps between the stones and lost energy moving through the structure. By the time it came out the other side, it was no longer wind in the sense that mattered for erosion and crop stress. It was air, and air without velocity did not lift topsoil. Wesley looked at him for a long moment. He asked where Emmett had learned that. Emmett set the stone back against the base of the wall. He said he had not learned it. He had watched it. 6 years of watching what the wind did when it hit the wall from 400 feet of completed section to the full half-mile. The dust patterns, the soil color, the moisture gradients, the crop response. He had been watching it build year by year and recording it in a journal, and he had known for several seasons that the numbers were going to be what the numbers were going to be. Wesley did not say anything else for a while. He was doing the kind of arithmetic that extension agents do, translating field observations into the language of documentation, calibrating what he was seeing against the categories his training had given him for understanding it. He asked if he could come back with instruments. He came back 3 times that summer with an anemometer and soil probes and a camera. He measured wind velocity at intervals behind the wall from 10 feet to 300 feet downwind, charting the gradient of reduction as distance from the stone increased. He measured soil moisture at matching intervals on both sides of the wall. He photographed the wheat at different stages of development, building a visual record that his notes could not fully capture. The anemometer told him what Emmett had been estimating by thread and observation. Wind velocity on the downwind side of the wall was 60 to 75% lower than on the upwind side for a distance of up to 200 feet. Beyond 200 feet, the effect diminished, but even at that distance, the reduction was meaningful in a county where wind was the primary limiting factor for both soil retention and crop development. Wesley wrote it all down in the government notebook he carried. He wrote it carefully with the thoroughness of someone who understood that what he was documenting was going to require a more complete record than he had anticipated when he stopped on the county road in late May. The harvest came in August of 1968. Emmett ran his combine across the west quarter in the heat of a Kansas August and watched the yield monitor tell him a number he had not seen on that ground before: 39 bushels per acre. He stopped the combine at the end of the first pass and looked at the number for a long moment. The west quarter, the ground that had given him 21 bushels in 1962 and similarly inadequate numbers in every year before that. The ground that was supposed to be his worst ground for as long as he farmed it, 39 bushels, 3 bushels above the county average. He started the combine again and finished the field. That evening, he opened the farm journal and wrote the number at the top of the 1968 page, where it would be the first thing he saw when he opened to that year. Then he set the journal on the table and left it there and sat across from it for a while in the quiet of the house. Vera came in from the kitchen and saw the open journal and looked at the number at the top of the page. She sat down at the table with him. She did not say anything, and neither did he, and the quiet between them was the comfortable quiet again. The real quiet, the kind that had been present before 1965 and had come back after the morning with the coffee cups and had been present through every season since. Outside the west window of the house, half a mile away, in the last light of a Kansas evening, the wall stood along the boundary of the field. It had changed. The wind came out of the Colorado plains the way it always came, steady and relentless, crossing the open ground without interruption for 80 miles until it reached the western edge of Hamilton County. It hit the wall. The wall did not move. The number 39 traveled through Hamilton County the way numbers travel in farming communities, not through announcement, but through the quiet arithmetic of men who compare yields the way other men compare scores. By September of 1968, people knew what Emmett Caldwell had harvested on his west quarter. They knew it because the elevator tickets did not lie, and because Wesley Pruitt had been seen at the Caldwell farm 3 times with instruments, and because the wheat behind that stone wall had been visible from the county road since June in a way that demanded an explanation. The explanations that had served for 5 years were no longer adequate. Different soil on that end of the field did not explain 39 bushels on ground that had averaged 21 for 16 consecutive years. Different irrigation pressure did not explain it when Emmett ran the same water allocation across the entire west quarter. Different seed lot did not explain a yield that was 3 bushels above the county average on the worst positioned farmland in Hamilton County. The wall explained it, and the county was beginning slowly and without enthusiasm to accept that explanation. Emmett did not press the case. He had never been a man who pressed cases. He had made his argument in stone and yielded the floor to the evidence. And now the evidence was speaking in the only register that mattered in western Kansas, which was bushels per acre and soil color, and the darkness of ground that was holding its moisture instead of surrendering it to the wind. He kept farming, he kept measuring, he kept adding entries to the journal that had become over 6 years of careful notation, a record of something more significant than one man's field observations. It was a document of a problem being solved from the ground up without institutional support, without research backing, without anyone telling him it was possible. Wesley Pruitt understood this better than anyone. Wesley had spent the summer of 1968 doing what scientists do when they encounter something that does not fit the existing categories. He had measured everything he could measure. He had documented everything he could document. He had run his numbers against the established literature on windbreaks and shelter belts and found that Emmett Caldwell's wall was performing in ways that the literature had not predicted for a structure of its dimensions, and that the reasons for this were embedded in the physical characteristics of the wall in ways that the shelter belt research had not needed to account for. Trees were porous. Wind moved through a tree row, losing velocity as it went, but the structure itself was permeable. A stone wall was impermeable at its face, but permeable through its gaps, and the combination produced a turbulence pattern on the downwind side that dissipated energy differently than a tree row did. The mass of the wall absorbed kinetic energy that a tree row deflected. The result was a larger protected zone per unit of wall height than the existing models predicted. Wesley wrote this up in the fall of 1968. He wrote it carefully in the measured language of an extension service publication, citing his field measurements and noting the limitations of a single-site study. He sent it to the Kansas State Extension Office for review. He told them he intended to publish it in 1969 or 1970, pending their feedback. He also told Emmett what he was doing. They were standing at the wall on a September morning, the harvest done and the ground bare, and Wesley said he thought the documentation should go into the official record. He said he thought other farmers in the county needed to know what the numbers showed. He said he had been wrong in 1962 to dismiss the idea without investigation, and that the dismissal had been based on the absence of precedent rather than the presence of contrary evidence, which was not the same thing, and which he should have distinguished more carefully at the time. Emmett listened to this without interruption. Then he said he appreciated it. And he meant it without any edge, without the satisfaction of a man delivering the words "I told you so" in a different arrangement. He meant it simply as the acknowledgement of a conversation that needed to happen and had now happened, and that could be set aside so that the practical question of what came next could be addressed. The practical question of what came next was already being settled without either of them. Burton Hale drove past Emmett Caldwell's West Quarter for the last time in the spring of 1970 and stopped his truck on the county road and did not move for a long time. He had driven this road every week for 8 years. He had watched the wall go up course by course over 6 of those years, had watched the section behind the completed wall develop its distinctive character through 3 growing seasons, had watched the 1968 harvest yield make its way through the community, the way unwelcome information makes its way sideways and slowly working against the grain of what people had already decided to believe. He had continued to believe what he had decided to believe because Burton Hale was a man who had built his authority on being right, and being wrong about something he had been publicly right about for 6 years was not a simple revision. It was a structural problem. It required not just changing a position, but acknowledging that the position had been held with more certainty than the evidence warranted, and that the certainty had influenced other people, and that some of those other people were now farming with less protection than they might have had if he had been less certain and more curious in 1962. Burton did not think in these terms explicitly. He was not given to the kind of self-examination that produces explicit conclusions. But he sat in his truck on the county road in the spring of 1970 and looked at the wheat behind Emmett Caldwell's wall and understood something that his stomach understood before his mind caught up with it. The wheat was darker, thicker. The stalks were straight in the morning wind instead of bending with the sustained lean that characterized wheat on unprotected ground throughout the county. The soil between the rows was visibly different in color from the pale ground across the fence line to the north, where his neighbor Dobbins was running the same seed in the same weather without the same results. 2 fields of wheat separated by a fence line and a stone wall, and the difference between them was not subtle. It was the difference between a good crop and an average one, between soil that was holding and soil that was blowing, between a farm that was gaining ground in the most literal sense and a farm that was losing it. He sat for a long time. Then he drove to Emmett Caldwell's farmstead. Emmett was in the barn when Burton's truck pulled into the yard. He was at the bench grinder sharpening a cultivator shovel that had worn down to a shape that was no longer useful, the orange sparks falling onto the concrete floor and dying in the dust. He heard the truck and did not stop working. He finished the edge he was grinding, checked the bevel with his thumb, set the shovel on the bench. Burton came through the barn door and stood just inside it the way a man stands when he is not certain of his reception. He looked around the barn with the movement of a man who is organizing himself before he says something difficult. He looked at the equipment, at the wall, at the view through the open back door toward the stone wall, visible on the western horizon. Burton said that the wall was working. Emmett said it had been for 3 years. Burton said that the wheat looked different from everyone else's. Emmett said it was different. It had topsoil under it. There was a pause that both men occupied differently. Emmett picked up the cultivator shovel and examined the edge in the light from the barn door. Burton looked at his boots, then at the wall on the horizon, then at Emmett. He said he had called it medieval. Emmett said he had. He said he had told people that Emmett was going back to the Stone Age. Emmett said he had said that too. Burton was quiet for a moment. That was not comfortable but was honest, which was a different thing. He asked how much it would cost to build one on his brother's place. His brother was losing ground on his west quarter as well. He said the same problem, the same thin soil, the same inadequate yields. Emmett set the shovel down on the bench. He told Burton that the rocks were free, that every farmer in the county had them in his fence rows and his gullies, that they came up out of the ground every spring and would keep coming up every spring, regardless of whether anyone built anything with them. He told Burton that the labor was his brother's own, that no equipment was required beyond what any farm already had, and the hands to do the work. He told Burton that the price was 6 years, that 2 men working together could probably do it in 3. Burton did not say anything else. He turned and walked out of the barn and got in his truck and drove north. The next spring, a stone wall began going up on the farm that belonged to Burton Hale's brother, 3 miles north of Emmett's property. Wesley Pruitt published his bulletin in 1973. The title was Stone Windbreaks in Western Kansas, an Alternative to Traditional Shelter Belts. It was 16 pages long and included yield data from Emmett's farm across 5 seasons, soil moisture measurements from both sides of the wall during 2 drought years, and a construction guide based on the methods Emmett had developed over 6 years of trial and observation. It was the first official document in the history of the Soil Conservation Service to present dry-stacked stone walls as a viable soil conservation technique on the Great Plains. Wesley sent a copy to Emmett with a note that said only that the bulletin was now part of the official record and that he thought the official record had been incomplete without it. Emmett read the bulletin at the kitchen table. He read it the way he read things completely and once without going back. He set it on the table beside the farm journal that had been accumulating as quiet evidence since 1963. 2 documents, one written in the careful language of government publication and one in the shorthand of a farmer who had been watching and measuring and not saying much. The same story in different registers. He put the journal on top of the bulletin, closed both of them, and went out to check the cattle. The Soil Conservation Service sent a field officer to Hamilton County in 1974. His name was not important, and his title was not important, and the agency he worked for was not important, in the way that Emmett was thinking about things by then. What was important was that the man came with instruments and spent 3 days measuring what the wall had been doing since 1962. He measured soil loss on Emmett's protected ground and on unprotected ground of equivalent position and soil type. He measured it with the scientific rigor of a federal agency that needed numbers it could put in a report. He found that soil loss on the protected ground was for practical purposes 0. He found that soil loss on unprotected, comparable ground in the county averaged 2 tons per acre per year. 2 tons per acre per year on 320 acres. That was 640 tons of topsoil per year that Emmett's wall had stopped from blowing east. Over 30 years, if the wall continued to perform as it had performed for the first 12, the number was close to 20,000 tons. 20,000 tons of topsoil that stayed on the Caldwell farm, while the topsoil of neighboring unprotected farms continued its journey to Oklahoma. The field officer asked Emmett how he had known the wall would work. Emmett considered the question carefully, the way he considered questions that deserved a careful answer. He said he had not known. He had guessed, and the guess had been educated by 16 years of watching wind hit every vertical surface on his farm. The barn, the grain bin, the equipment shed. Every one of them had a calm zone on the downwind side where the dust did not blow, and the snow piled up. A wall was a longer, lower version of a building. The same physics but built from the material the land provided. He said that the rocks were not useful to a farmer who was trying to plow. They broke equipment and slowed work and cost money every spring. But they were very useful to a farmer who was trying to stop wind. The problem defined the usefulness of the material. Different problem, different definition of what was worth having. The officer included this in his report. It was cited in 3 subsequent Soil Conservation Service publications as a useful articulation of the principle behind vernacular soil conservation. Emmett did not know it was being cited. It would not have changed anything if he had known. By 1975, there were 7 stone walls in Hamilton County. Emmett had built one of them. The other 6 had been built by farmers who came to his property, walked the length of the wall, studied the construction, and went home to do the same thing on their own western boundaries. They did not ask permission. They did not pay a fee. They came, they looked, they understood what could be understood through observation, and they built. This was the way useful knowledge traveled in farming communities. And it was the appropriate way because the knowledge was not proprietary, and the technique was not complicated, and the material was free. What was required was the willingness to spend the time, and the willingness had to be generated by each person in each situation, and it could not be given to them by anyone else. Frank Dobbins, the neighbor who had first given Emmett stones from his fence rows in 1962, started his own wall in 1971. He was a methodical man, and he built methodically, and his wall was complete by 1975. He told Emmett when he started it in the direct way of a man settling a debt he had been carrying for a while that he had been wrong to think it would not work and right to give him the rocks regardless. And that both of those things were true at the same time, which was how things usually were. Emmett said he appreciated the rocks. Dobbins said he had more if Emmett ever needed them. The community that had given Emmett the name Rockman in 1962 did not rescind the name because communities do not formally rescind things. What happened instead was that the name changed weight. Rockman had meant something dismissive in 1962. By 1975, it meant something else, something that acknowledged what the name had always described: a man defined by his relationship to the stones that came out of his ground every spring and the use he had found for them. Danny Caldwell took over the primary operation of the farm in the late 1970s. Emmett was in his 60s by then, his body carrying the inventory of 4 decades of physical work in the way that a farmer's body carries it, not broken but spent, in places that could not be fully replenished. He kept his hand in the work. He was present for planting and harvest, present for the decisions that required the kind of judgment that came from knowing a particular piece of land for a long time. But the daily labor belonged to Danny now. Danny extended the wall in 1979. He added a 1/4 mile to the north end, extending the protection further up the western boundary in the direction from which the worst northers arrived. He worked the way his father had worked in the morning hours and the evening hours and the full days on weekends, and he used the same selection method, the same fitting technique, the same patient attention to the orientation of each stone against the ones surrounding it. It took him 4 years. He worked alone on weekends for 4 years, and the extension was done in 1983, adding another 1,300 feet to what his father had built. He did not tell his father how long it took. Emmett could see the progress from the farmstead, could watch the wall growing north, the way he had watched his own wall growing north for 6 years, and he did not need to be told how long it took because he understood already from his own experience exactly what 4 years of weekend work felt like in the body of a man doing it. What he did not say to Danny, because he was not a man who said things of this kind directly, was that watching his son lay stone along the western boundary of the farm they shared was one of the most satisfying things he had witnessed. Not because of what it meant for the soil or the yields or the conservation record, though it meant all of those things, but because of what it meant about the transmission of something that had no name in the official language of agriculture, the knowledge that lived in hands and eyes, and the particular quality of attention that allowed a man to look at a pile of rocks and see something that nobody else had seen yet. Danny had it. He had watched his father long enough to absorb it, and now he was using it. Ardith Caldwell was Danny's daughter, born in 1982, and she grew up on the farm the way farm children grow up inside the rhythms of it. Her early years shaped by the sounds and smells and physical requirements of agricultural work in western Kansas. She knew the wall the way she knew the barn and the grain bins and the farmstead itself as a permanent feature of the landscape that had always been there and that she had never thought to question. She began questioning it in college. She was studying agricultural science at Kansas State University in the early 2000s, and one of her professors assigned a paper on vernacular soil conservation practices that had developed outside of institutional research, carried by farmers rather than scientists, transmitted through observation rather than publication. Ardith wrote about the wall. She wrote about it from the inside with the access that comes from being the granddaughter of the man who built it, with the farm journals and the yield records and the Wesley Pruitt Bulletin and the Soil Conservation Service report from 1974, and with her own memory of walking the wall as a child, running her hand along the top course, the way her grandfather had run his hand along it on the morning of completion. She called the paper Vernacular Soil Conservation Stone Windbreaks as an indigenous response to wind erosion in western Kansas. She was proud of the title. Her professor read the paper and made one change. He crossed out the word vernacular and wrote brilliant. He gave her an A and told her she should consider submitting it to the undergraduate research journal. She submitted it. It was published in the spring of 2004, the first peer-reviewed documentation of Emmett Caldwell's wall by a member of the family that had built it. Emmett read it at the kitchen table in the same house where he had opened the farm journal and shown Vera the numbers on a difficult evening in 1965. He was 86 years old. His hands were the hands of a man who had handled stone for 30 years, the skin thickened and the joints large, and the grip still present even if it was no longer what it had been. He read the paper completely the way he read things without going back. He set it on the table. He said it was a good paper. Danny asked him what he thought about the word brilliant. Emmett thought about it for a moment. He said the professor had probably meant the technique, not the man. The technique was old, I'll say, older than Kansas, older than America. It had been used in Scotland and Ireland and New England for 1,000 years. What had been done here was not invention. It was the application of existing knowledge to a specific problem in a specific place, which was what farmers had always done when the tools available did not match the problem present. Danny said he thought the professor had meant both. Emmett did not respond to this. He folded the paper along its original creases and put it in the roll-up desk where the farm journals were kept beside the journal that had started in 1963 and the Wesley Pruitt Bulletin and the Conservation Service report, the accumulated record of something that had begun with a man standing at his fence line, looking at a pile of rocks and asking a question nobody else in Hamilton County had thought to ask. He went out to check the cattle. The wall was 42 years old that spring. The oldest sections, the courses Emmett had laid in 1962 and 1963, had settled into a density that made them indistinguishable from natural stone formations at certain angles of light. The limestone had weathered to the same gray-brown of the high plain surface, and the fitted faces of the stones had developed the particular patina of long exposure, the surface texture that stone acquires over decades of freeze and thaw and wind and the slow chemistry of weather. It still worked. Every spring, when Wesley Pruitt's successor, a younger man who had inherited the county extension files and eventually inherited Wesley's reverence for what the Caldwell Wall represented, came through on his annual tour, he stopped at the wall and took measurements, and the measurements continued to confirm what measurements had been confirming since 1968. Wind velocity reduction of 60 to 75% in the protected zone. Soil loss on the protected ground effectively zero. Soil color and moisture retention measurably better than unprotected, comparable ground throughout the county. The yield advantage had compounded over the years in ways that even Emmett's careful projections had not fully anticipated because the advantage was not linear. Each year of improved soil retention produced slightly better conditions than the year before, and slightly better conditions produced slightly better yields, and slightly better yields permitted slightly more investment in the ground, and the ground responded to investment in ways that depleted ground could not. The West Quarter that had given Emmett 21 bushels in 1962 was regularly producing 45 or more by the early 2000s on ground that the county assessor's office still valued below the county median because the value tables had not been updated to account for what a stone wall could do to the productive capacity of western exposure farmland. The county records were behind the reality the way county records usually are behind the reality. The reality was in the soil. Dark, deep, holding moisture in a county where most fields had lost half their original topsoil depth since 1946. The West Quarter had gained soil, not the fraction of an inch that takes 500 years to build through natural processes, but measurable accumulation, the dust that the wall stopped from leaving, adding its weight to the ground it could not escape. 20,000 tons over 30 years. Emmett had heard the Conservation Service number and had not said much about it because the number was real, but the number was not why he had built the wall. He had built the wall because the soil was blowing away and he had rocks and time. The 20,000 tons was not a goal. It was a consequence. The consequence was still accumulating. Ardith came back to the farm every spring after college. She had gone on to graduate work in soil science and then to a position with a conservation organization that worked on Great Plains farmland, and the wall she had grown up beside had become a professional reference point as well as a personal one. She brought colleagues to see it. She brought students. She stood beside it on field days and walked visitors along its length and explained the construction and the physics and the history with the particular fluency of someone who knew a subject from the inside as well as the outside. She always ended the walk at the north end of the extension Danny had built, where the wall terminated at the northwest corner of the property. She would stand there and look south along the full length of the wall, 3,940 feet of dry stacked stone running from the northwest corner to the southwest corner of the Caldwell farm, and she would tell whoever was with her what her Uncle Danny had said at her grandfather's funeral. My father looked at rocks and saw a wall. Everyone else looked at the same rocks and saw trash. That is the difference between a man who solves problems and a man who complains about them. The rocks were always there. The wind was always there. My father just put one in front of the other. She had heard those words for the first time standing in the Mennonite church in Syracuse in 2007 at a service that was small and quiet, the way Emmett Caldwell had been small and quiet all his life. Wesley Pruitt was there, retired and old, his government truck long since turned in. The Soil Conservation Service field officer, who had measured the wall in 1974, was there driven up from Wichita by his son. Frank Dobbins' son was there representing the neighbor who had given Emmett his first load of someone else's rocks in the spring of 1962. Burton Hale was not there. Burton had died in 1991. But his brother was there, the man who had built the second wall in Hamilton County on Burton's recommendation, the man who had watched his own yields improve behind his own stone barrier for 20 years, and who understood what he was paying respect to in that small church in Syracuse on a cold November morning. Ardith stood in the church and listened to Danny speak and thought about the wall in the way that you think about something that has been present your entire life and that you have finally begun to understand fully. She thought about her grandfather at 16 spending his first mornings at the southwest corner of the property, laying the first course of stones along a fence line, while the community assigned him a name that was meant to diminish what he was doing. She thought about 6 years of early mornings and late evenings, and the particular quality of patience that sustained work requires when no one believes in it. She thought about the journal and the roll-up desk, the careful entries in farm shorthand that added up over 5 years to an argument that could not be answered. She thought about the morning Emmett had walked the completed wall from end to end and come inside for breakfast. She had heard this story from Danny. She had heard it from Vera in the last years before Vera died, when Vera talked sometimes about the early years of the wall, the way old people talk about things they saw clearly only in retrospect. Vera had described the morning Emmett came inside after walking the wall and sat down for breakfast, and Danny asked him if he was satisfied, and Emmett said, "Ask me after harvest." Vera had said that she understood, hearing those words, that the question Emmett was living inside was not whether he had done what he set out to do. The wall was finished. He had done what he set out to do. The question was whether the world would confirm what he knew to be true, and the world had not yet confirmed it, and he would not claim the answer until the world had weighed in. That was who he was. A man who did not claim answers until the evidence provided them, who built for 39 bushels in a season when the yield was still theoretical, who went to breakfast after 6 years of labor with the same plainness he would have brought to any other morning. The wind came out of Colorado that November morning the way it came every morning. Steady, relentless, indifferent. It crossed 80 miles of open range and hit the western edge of Hamilton County, and found, as it had been finding since October of 1967, 3,940 feet of dry stacked limestone and granite and flint standing 4 feet high along the boundary of a farm that had once been the worst positioned ground in the county. The stones that Emmett Caldwell had pulled out of his fields and thrown away for 16 years, the stones that every farmer in Hamilton County pulled out of his fields and threw away every spring, the stones that broke plow blades and jammed combines and punctured tires and made every man who farmed this ground curse at least once per season. Those stones stood in the wind and held. They had always held. They would hold after everyone who had watched them being built was gone. They would hold after the farm journals in the roll-up desk had turned to paper too fragile to open. They would hold after the government bulletins in the Conservation Service reports had been filed in archives that no one visited anymore. They would hold because that was what stone did when it was properly fitted and properly placed and built by someone who understood that the most important quality in any structure was not how quickly it went up, but how long it stayed. Ardith drove back to the farm every spring. She drove the county road past the wall on the way in, and she looked at it the way she had looked at it since she was a child, the long gray line running north along the fence, the fitted faces of the stones catching the morning light, the wheat on the downwind side standing straighter and darker than the wheat across the fence line. She walked the fields when the wheat was up. She pressed her hand flat against the soil on both sides of the wall and felt the difference in moisture that her grandfather had first measured with a rod and a noting hand in the spring of 1963. She looked at the soil color the way he had looked at it, reading what the darkness told her about what was staying put. Every spring, when the freeze and thaw cycle pushed new rocks to the surface of the fields around the wall, she picked them up the same way her grandfather had picked them up, the same way her father had picked them up. She carried them to the wall and added them to the sections that had settled over decades and left small gaps at the top course that could use another stone. Not because the wall needed them, because the wall had taught her family that nothing the land gives you is waste. Not if you know what the problem is. Not if you are willing to ask the question differently. Not if you have the patience to let the answer take as long as the answer needs to take. The rocks were always there. The wind was always there. One man put one in front of the other, and the soil stopped blowing.